Only when the sacral mind is absorbed in finding out the pleasure of who they're not who they are, but who they're not. I'm not that thing, and I'm not that thing, and I'm not that thing. That's the beginning of their journey. And you see, there's something wonderful about that, what I'm not, because it's the identification of the not self. It's the identification of all the conditioning that's taken place. It's a very, very deep learning. And remember something, because this is mechanical, because it is logical, that the moment that sacral being is going to something is the moment that it resonates through their whole being. I mean, their whole being knows that really is correct for them, regardless of where the mind is. There's this incredible resonance inside. After all, this is the life process. And every time you have that sacral response, what you have is that clear cut. It's like Zen, whoosh. It's right to the point. It's right there. So for these beings to go through this process right away is to get a strength in themselves they've never had. And it's one of the things I notice most. I mean, after all, that's what slaves are. You talk about Dachau. The other night there was this clip going by. And it was a clip of all these people in one of the ghettos in Hungary or something. And I'm a manifester. And I look at all these people walking off to their death. And, as they did all over the world at that time. And I look at that and I think, Jesus, me? I could not do that. You're not going to walk me anywhere. I mean, that's me, eh? And, I look at the generators in the world, love generators. I look at the generators in the world and I see this stupid sheep. They will walk into the gas chamber because that's what slaves do. Slaves are slaves are slaves are slaves are slaves. They never stop being slaves. As long as you're a generator living the not self, you're a slave. And you're a slave to anything that will imprison you. And a willing slave to anything that will imprison you and use you and take advantage of you and burn you out, because that's what it is. That's what slaves are for. If you're going to bring slaves into the field to work for you, you don't care whether they die doing the job. They're just slaves. They're not worth anything. They're only worth as much as they do as long as they do it, and then you replace them with another slave. You don't have to look after them. You don't have to care about them. And you have to see what the generator field attracts because of that. And how painful that is. Oh, yes, I know how easy it is for them to be transformed, but I also know the horror of what the generator life is. How deep that frustration is, how much resistance is there in their life. How uncomfortable it is to be such an energy being in which your energy must be active all the time, and yet not to be able to do anything that feels good to do. And to be under all the conditioned pressures that are there because of the manifester propaganda that turns generators into chaos cases. They will not become themselves easily unless their minds are their allies. It's that simple. But that's criteria number one for them. There's no point in them just going out the door and being ready to experiment with responding. Their mind won't be their ally. Out of every 100 generators that I do a reading for, there's maybe 10, that can really just jump in. And the rest of them, their minds, it's so difficult. It is so difficult because remember something. If you're an energy type and you're not a manifester and you try to manifest throughout your life, your sense of self-worth is awful. I mean, it's awful. There is so much resistance. There is so much discomfort. And these are generally people, because one of the biggest problems with generators is that generators don't eat properly. I mean, they don't eat properly, because they manifest their diet. It's my classic image of a generator in a restaurant. Generator goes into the restaurant, tells the waitress what they want, tells the waiter what they want. Give me this, give me that. That's what I want. That's manifesting. And it's manifesting them. So one of the things that's so important about that generator is that they have to have somebody they're going to link with, so they're going to be able to go through that process. So their mind is immediately their ally. And then it's easy. I mean, then you get to a point where truly it's just easy, because you see, once they recognize clearly within themselves what they're not, then they can fully embrace the process. And in fully embracing that process, their mind can continue to explore not what they're not anymore, but what they're becoming. Ah, look what I responded to. Look what came my way. Look, it all does come. You know, all of these things that reaffirm the value of the strategy for the generator and liberate them from the torment of their mind saying to them, this isn't going to work. You know, remember, these are minds that have been nurtured by frustration. You know, if you've got a mind that's nurtured by frustration, you don't have a mind that willingly is going to say, this is going to work, this is going to be excellent, this is going to be terrific, you know, all of these things. The generator has to be focused on that self-discovery at the mental level. At the mental level. Remember, it's going to take 7 years for a generator to move from slave to builder. And the builder doesn't build what the slave had to build. They're very different beings because the energy is used differently. And that the real being that's there emerges afterwards. You know, I know how many people now, because I've been teaching long enough, I've watched people go through their 7-year process. For each of those beings, I always have a reminder for them. I'm in my 3rd 7-year cycle since the voice. And I know how different each one is. They're really different because I'm becoming more and more and more and more the perfection of what I am. I don't know what that means in terms of the whole, but in terms of me, in other words, I'm actually, you know, becoming myself. It's an ongoing process, but I'm becoming myself freed of all the conditioning. So the person that you become isn't that person you reach when you finish your 7-year process. At the end of that 7-year process, there's a baby there that's then going to start, you know, discovering who it really is. So this first step with the sacral mind, it's not about them being able to see who they are going to be later. It's about learning to see that what they really are is not the same as they thought before. In that moment of somebody saying to you, you know, do you like the job you're doing? You know, and all of a sudden you hear yourself go, You know, what you're really dealing with is that you're dealing with the fact that there are all kinds of things behind you that are still around you that do not belong to you, that are not correct for you, and that's your way to know immediately. And again, it's for the mind to feed on. You know, as long as the mind is occupied with the same process as the mechanics are guiding, you know, then you have your greatest chances for success. And the moment that that generator mind gets excited by hearing what the answer is going to be, and not the mental answer, because at that point the generator mind will hear the sacral go, and it'll say, geez, I never would have said that. That's interesting. And suddenly you have your mind involved in its own destruction, you know? Deeply involved in saying, well, it's really interesting. No, don't say anything. Let's see what else comes. Because the mind loves that. And it's such an easy seduction. You know, as I said, and I've said it so many times, the easiest path to being awake, generator's path. Because they can turn in a moment. They can completely transform their life in a moment. They don't all do, obviously. There's all kinds of frequencies, and emotional generators aren't going to transform their existence in a moment. But the reality is that they are designed to be able to answer for themselves fundamental questions no other type has access to. They just don't. You can ask me any bloody question you like, and if I don't want to answer it, I won't. You know, I am not designed that way. You know, if you're a generator and you're living out your nature and somebody says, you know, do you love me? And you know it's going to cause a lot of pain, you know, Generators are designed for that. They're designed to be honest. I mean, honest. Hey, this is the cleanest thing in the world, is a sacral response. There's nothing cleaner than that. It may be disturbing. After all, anything that's curt is. We as human beings like our, politeness built into the language. We like to, how are you, as if we care. We're careful with all those things. We sort of like to get, verbally, we like to sort of nuance our way to those things. But the sacral knows no nuance. Poor. There's no, I kind of will and I really would, but I couldn't, and this and that. No. All of the concepts of surrender are rooted in the sacral. Everything about the nature of surrender begins with the sacral. Everything that we call enlightenment begins with the sacral. Everything that we refer to as awakeness begins with the sacral. The sacral is the fountain of life. The reality is that if you look at the 9 gates of the sacral, they actually relate to every other gate in the body graph. Every other gate in the body graph. The sacral center is the center of life. It is the prime engine, the prime motor of life. The energy types, nearly 80% of the population, always operating in their strategies breath for breath. The manifester has to recognize who they impact. The generator mind has to research who they are. Who they are. You see, the manifester, the projector and reflector, their first task isn't to discover themselves. For the mind, now remember, we're talking about how to seduce the mind into being an ally of transformation. The manifester mind has to be involved with who do we impact. It's only out of seeing who they impact that they begin to get an impression of who they are. But it's not direct. No manifester can look in the mirror and say, who am I? They can't. It doesn't work. They can see who they affect, and out of who they affect begin to gauge what they are, but not who they are. Okay? You'll see that the reflector has to be involved with who we are, because it's a we. It's not a who. It's a we. And that we is not only the fact that they're influenced by the cycle of the moon so that they have a specific designed frequency, but also that they are instrumental within communities. And their we is always relative to who they are with. And so they're not looking at themselves. After all, they have no defined self. They're looking at who we are. The projectors are only concerned with who sees me. Not who I am. Who sees me? So when you get to the generator is the only one that's there to say, well, who am I? And if their mind doesn't get an answer right away, they'll say to you, this strategy stuff is bullshit. We still don't know who we are. Somebody asked me if I wanted a cup of coffee, and I went, but that doesn't tell me who I am. It just tells me that I am able to make a decision that way. Just a mechanism. Eh? They ask me, I go, or just a mechanism. But the mind, remember, I'm talking about the mind. The mind is up there saying, yeah, so? I wanted the coffee anyway. I could have asked for it in the first place. What do you think I'm doing here in this cafe? The mind immediately is in there saying, well, all right, yeah, it's interesting, but it doesn't tell me who I am. So the first thing you got to do with the generator is that you got to get the generator mind on the path of finding out who they are. Look, you've got to find somebody that you trust, that you can sit with, that you can have them ask you all kinds of things. Now, ideally, it's somebody who knows design, and ideally, it's another generator, but it doesn't have to be. It could be anybody. It could be anybody. You know, if you really want to shock them, it can be your lover. And you say, look, I want to find out who I am. You want to ask me? And by the way, beware. Because if you ask me if I love you and I go, you're in trouble, man. In other words, the most important thing for the generator mind is as quickly as possible, they get this impression of who they really are. Now, obviously, that's all going to be fleshed out as they enter into their 7-year program. But to be able to start with that is a head start for their mind. Because the mind then says, oh, look at all this stuff we found out. There must be more. Let's hear some more questions. Can you imagine what a seduction that is for the generator's mind, that it's saying, hey, wait, don't do anything. Wait for the question. Let's see what else we can find out about ourselves. Instead of that mind saying, oh, yeah, it's interesting, but come on, we could have had the coffee anyway. Very, very important. And to me, it's one of the most perfect ways to get the generator mind involved immediately in the miracle of discovering who they are